Have you ever stopped to think that the perfect girl from your neighborhood might be carrying secrets no one imagines? Nancy Wheeler seems like the exemplary student, but behind the smile and the good grades, there is a daily battle between guilt, fear, and courage. It is that feeling that no matter how much we try, the world insists on placing monsters in the way, and I am not talking only about the upside down. The paradox. Sometimes it is exactly the chaos that awakens the strength you did not even know you had. Imagine feeling that every wrong decision can cost someone's life, or that trusting people is almost an emotional Russian roulette. Nancy lives this on her skin, and it is exactly at this point that her story connects with ours. Because who has never felt overwhelmed by other people's expectations or trapped between reason and heart may cast the first stone. The difference is that she does not run away. She faces it even when fear screams louder. And the most interesting part, every trauma, every doubt, every fear does not destroy Nancy. She turns all of it into fuel. She shows us that true power is not in never falling, but in continuing even when everything seems lost. Want to find out how the girl who seemed ordinary became an icon of courage and vulnerability? Then come with me, because this analysis will open the backstage of an incredible mind and maybe even make you see yourself in a way you never imagined. If you are a fan of cinema psychology and want to understand the mind behind your favorite character, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss any video. But first, comment below which character you want me to analyze here on the channel. Now, let's go to the video. Nancy Wheeler enters the scene as that girl who, at first glance, seems to have life under control. The typical good student with good grades, a stable social circle, and a promising future, but as it happens in Stranger Things, nothing is as predictable as it seems. The town of Hawkins is the backdrop, but the real stage is inside her, a heart divided between the desire to fit in and the need to discover who she really is. Behind the restrained smile and the attentive eyes, there is a Nancy who wants more than the role of the good girl. She feels that there is something beyond the school walls and the expectations people place on her. It is that uncomfortable feeling of living life on autopilot, you know? Like when you look around and think, is this really all? Nancy begins to realize that the perfect routine hides a screaming emptiness. Everything changes when the disappearance of Will and the death of Barb cross her path. These events work as a rupture in her safety bubble, a kind of emotional earthquake. Suddenly, the well-behaved Nancy needs to deal with chaos, fear, and mainly guilt. It is the turning point where the girl who followed rules begins to break them one by one in search of answers. But the most curious thing is that Nancy does not transform overnight. The change comes in layers, like someone removing one mask at a time. The first is the obedient teenager, the second, the guilty friend, and finally, the woman who decides she will not stay silent anymore. And it is exactly there that she begins to discover herself, not in comfort, but in pain. The interesting thing is to notice how the environment around Nancy reflects her internal conflict. While the upside down grows in the shadows, her emotional side also twists, trying to understand what is real and what is only a distorted version of her own identity. Hawkins becomes almost a mirror of what happens inside her, a peaceful place on the surface, but full of hidden monsters. And in the middle of all of this, she needs to deal with a type of pressure many people will identify with, the fear of disappointing. Parents, teachers, friends, everyone has expectations about what she must be. It is as if error were not allowed, and yet it is exactly by making mistakes that Nancy begins to find herself. It is curious how sometimes the fall is the first step for us to understand what freedom is. Nancy is that person who represents the transition between innocence and maturity. She begins believing the world is fair, that good people win, and ends up discovering that things are much more complex. It is a journey that speaks about growing not in a physical sense, but an emotional one, and this growth comes with a price. Stopping being who others want and becoming who you truly are, and it is at this point that her gaze changes. The Nancy who only observed now questions, the Nancy who asked for permission now confronts, and all of this only happens because the world around her collapsed, and, curiously, it was in this collapse that she found strength. But what happens when the need to be strong becomes an emotional armor? the guilt and the weight of responsibility for the death of Barb. The death of Barb is more than a tragedy for Nancy. It is a silent trauma. She not only loses a friend, but also the version of herself who believed she was in control. Guilt settles like a constant shadow, that voice that whispers if I had done something different, she would still be here. And who has never carried that kind of thought, right? That sensation that something bad happened because we failed to predict the unpredictable? The interesting part is how this guilt shapes Nancy's behavior from then on. She becomes obsessed with the truth, as if discovering what really happened to Barb could erase the weight she feels. It is like trying to clean a stain that never seems to come out. And on some level, we have all tried to fix the past, believing that this will give us peace again. Nancy begins to act differently, more impulsive, more stubborn, and in a way, more alive. It is curious how pain has this strange power to awaken parts of us that were dormant. She starts questioning authorities, challenging lies, and even putting herself in danger, as if the risk were a form of punishment and redemption at the same time. She needs to feel that she is paying for what happened. But this search is not only rational, it is emotional. Every step she takes toward the truth is also a step inward. The investigation about Barb becomes a kind of mirror. The deeper she goes, the more she sees herself. And let's be honest, sometimes facing who we are is much scarier than any monster from the upside down. The most symbolic thing is that Nancy's guilt does not come only from what happened, but from what she believes she should have done. And this "should" is one of the cruelest words in our emotional vocabulary. I should have been there. I should have paid attention. I should have said something. It is a prison made of assumptions, and she stays locked inside it for a long time. In moments like this, Nancy is not only trying to save Barb, she is trying to save herself. Because guilt has this corrosive effect. It does not destroy at once, but slowly wears down the confidence we have in who we are. And Nancy, who always thought she was strong, begins to doubt her own courage. It is the kind of pain that does not show up in scars, but that completely changes the way you look at the world. But it is exactly from this pain that the determination that defines Nancy Wheeler is born. Trauma becomes fuel. She understands she cannot change the past, but she can prevent the lie from continuing. And in a way, this quest for justice becomes a ritual of healing. She turns guilt into purpose, and that, psychologically, is one of the greatest signs of emotional maturity. But deep down, the question that remains is, how much of herself will she need to lose to keep carrying this burden? Because when guilt becomes identity, the line between redemption and self-destruction becomes very thin. The duality between reason and feeling. Nancy has always been driven by reason. Logic, planning, the need to understand everything clearly. It was her way of keeping the world under control. But Hawkins is not the kind of place where logic survives for long, right? And as things become darker and darker, Nancy is forced to deal with something she cannot measure, calculate, or prove: her own heart. It is almost funny how the brain tries to handle feelings that simply do not fit inside reason. She tries to rationalize what she feels for Steve, then for Jonathan. And in the middle of all this, she realizes that the problem is not choosing between two guys, it is choosing between two versions of herself. One that wants security and another that wants truth. And when emotion and reason go to war, there is no room left for peace. She represents that dilemma many people live with, wanting to have control over what they feel. It is like trying to tame the sea with a spoon. Nancy tries to follow the right path, the one that seems more coherent, but the heart insists on messing everything up. And deep down, it is this mess that makes her human, because who has never tried to rationalize a feeling that simply did not make sense? The most interesting part is that this duality does not limit itself to love. It is in everything. It is in the way she wants to be strong, but sometimes just wants to cry. It is in the way she faces monsters, but still feels afraid of disappointing others. Nancy is the portrait of someone trying to balance instinct and intellect, emotion and reason, and discovering that perfect balance simply does not exist. This tension between feeling and thinking creates a kind of silent anxiety. It is that internal weight of always having to decide what is right, even when the right thing does not feel fair. Nancy is the kind of person who thinks too much, feels too much, and sometimes lives too little. And this is a very real conflict, the fear of acting with the heart and regretting it later. In several moments, you can see that her reasoning is a kind of emotional defense. She uses logic as a shield. If she understands everything rationally, maybe she will feel less pain, right? The problem is that understanding is not the same as healing. Sometimes what heals is the opposite, allowing yourself to feel without understanding anything. The Nancy who falls in love is also the Nancy who takes risks. The one who doubts is the same one who matures. This contradiction between head and heart is what gives the character so much depth and what makes many people identify with her. Because deep down, we are also always trying to decipher what we feel as if emotion were a mathematical equation. And it is in this internal struggle that she begins to discover something important. Maybe true power is not in choosing between reason or emotion, but in accepting that both coexist inside her. But what happens when the world around her begins to demand that she choose a side? The weight of being a woman in an environment dominated by men. Nancy grows up in a world where being heard is in itself an act of courage. When she enters the newspaper, for example, the difference in treatment is striking. While her male colleagues are seen as ambitious, she is labeled bossy. It is that old story. When a man is firm, he is a leader. When a woman is firm, she is difficult. And this, of course, messes with anyone's head, even more with someone who just wants to be taken seriously. The most curious thing is that inside, Nancy tries to balance two opposite forces, the desire to assert herself and the fear of seeming aggressive. She learned that, to be respected, she needs to walk in a straight line through a minefield. One wrong step, and they judge her. And it is exactly this kind of environment that makes many people doubt their own value, even when they know how good they are at what they do. The newspaper becomes almost a microcosm of the real world. There, Nancy discovers that competence is not always enough. She needs to shout louder. And the price for that is high as well, because every time she has to prove something, a part of her wears out. It is as if the effort of being taken seriously steals the lightness of simply being. She carries the weight of representing something bigger, all the women who have been underestimated, ignored, or ridiculed for daring to have an opinion. And the interesting thing is how the series shows this, in a subtle yet powerful way. The Nancy who challenges the editor is not only confronting a boss, she is confronting an entire system. And inside her, this mix of anger and purpose is born, pushing her forward even when she seems tired of fighting. It is easy to look at her and think, but she is strong. And yes, she is. But strength is not a synonym for the absence of pain. Being strong is sometimes precisely the act of continuing, even when the world keeps trying to make you doubt yourself. Nancy feels the weight of having to be impeccable all the time, because one mistake can be used as a justification to say that she cannot handle the pressure. It is the kind of battle that does not show up in the newspapers, but happens every day, and psychologically, this is devastating. Because when someone lives in a constant state of alert, always proving, always justifying, the body and mind enter survival mode. Nancy is there, always prepared for a criticism, an interruption, a devaluation, and this kind of environment teaches you to protect yourself, but it also hardens the heart. Still, it is in this crossfire that she forges herself. Nancy learns to turn indignation into fuel. The voice that once trembled becomes a tool. And it is beautiful to see how, even without realizing it, she starts inspiring other people. Her courage has a side effect. She lights something in those who are watching, as if silently saying, I can too. But what happens when the fight for recognition starts to merge with her own identity? When proving she is capable becomes an armor so heavy that she forgets to allow herself to be vulnerable. The fear of losing control, Nancy has always had this almost visceral need to be in command. It is as if controlling things were a way to keep chaos at a distance. After all, when everything seems about to collapse, control becomes a kind of emotional shield. But the problem is that the world of Hawkins and hers does not respect plans. There, the unexpected is the rule. And little by little, Nancy realizes that control is a comfortable illusion, yet still an illusion. This need is born from fear. The fear of losing people, of being blamed again, of reliving what she felt with Barb. And fear, when we do not face it, ends up disguising itself as organization, as planning, as I just want everything to go right. But in reality, it is the dread of chaos that is driving the wheel. And the more she tries to hold the reins, the more the world slips through her fingers. Nancy lives that paradox many people understand well. Wanting to control everything precisely because she has already lost too much. It is like someone who cleans the entire house after a terrible day. Not because they enjoy it, but because they need to feel they still have control over something. And it is beautiful, but also sad, to notice how much she tries to hold herself together when everything around her collapses. In many moments, you can feel the tension in her gaze, the way she talks fast, the way she tries to anticipate risks, as if the future could be predicted with logic and precision. But the problem is that control demands a high price. It steals the present. Nancy is always one step ahead, but she is rarely here. And living like that is like running without ever arriving. Little by little, she starts to understand that control is actually a symptom of vulnerability. It is the brain saying, "I do not want to feel this again." And that is so human, right? Everyone has tried to protect themselves from pain by controlling the unpredictable, a relationship, an outcome, a feeling. But what Nancy discovers is that sometimes real power comes from letting go and trusting the process. When she finds herself facing real danger, the supernatural, the uncontrollable, this fear of losing control reaches its peak. But ironically, it is precisely when she loosens her grip a little that things start flowing. The more intuitive, more emotional, more human Nancy begins to emerge. As if she finally understood that being vulnerable is not weakness, it is courage. The fear of losing control is one of the hardest to deal with because it does not disappear, it transforms. Nancy does not stop being afraid. She just learns not to let fear drive her life. And this is where a new kind of strength begins, the kind that does not come from rigidity, but from flexibility. The strength that knows how to bend without breaking. But what happens when this new side of her, more free, more spontaneous, starts to conflict with everything she always believed herself to be? Emotional distancing and the difficulty of trusting. Over time, Nancy builds a kind of emotional shell, an invisible armor made of independence and distrust. It is as if with every loss, she lifts another brick between herself and the world. After all, trusting has become a synonym for vulnerability, and vulnerability for her is the first step toward being hurt again. This withdrawal does not come from ego, but from the fear of reliving the pain that attachment can bring. She learned in the hardest way that people can disappear and that promises do not always mean safety. This lesson, although cruel, shapes the way she relates to others. Nancy begins to isolate herself emotionally, even when surrounded by people. It is that loneliness that does not come from the absence of others, but from the absence of openness. And the saddest part is that deep down, she wants to connect. She just no longer knows how. This distancing is the most human defense mechanism that exists. Everyone has built a wall after a disappointment. The problem is that, over time, the wall that protects also imprisons. Nancy gets used to being the one who solves everything alone, the one who needs no one. But this self-sufficiency that looks like strength is often just a disguised cry for help. In relationships, this appears between the lines. The way she takes time to trust, how she analyzes each gesture, each word, it is almost as if she were always waiting for the moment the other person will fail. And this kind of unconscious expectation turns love into a minefield. Because when we live expecting the mistake, inevitably it appears, even if we create it without meaning to. Psychologically, this is the reflection of an unresolved trauma. The fear of loss creates a version of ourselves that prefers solitude over the risk of disappointment. Nancy walks this tightrope. She wants closeness but fears the price of it. And what is most fascinating is how this blends with the environment of Hawkins, a place where no one knows whom to trust or what is truly real. And this is where the most beautiful paradox of the character emerges. The more she tries to protect herself from pain, the farther she gets from the things that could heal her. Affection, friendship, trust, all of that requires openness, and openness requires courage. And Nancy, strong as she is, still has not learned how to feel safe without control. But little by little, through the experiences she lives alongside the group, she begins to understand that trusting is not a guarantee of not being hurt, it is only proof that you are alive. That feeling fear and continuing anyway is one of the most human gestures that exist. And maybe that is why she keeps fighting, even when her heart insists on closing off. But when the fear of trusting mixes with the need to be in control, the heart becomes a battlefield. And this internal war will still shape decisions far deeper than she imagines. All these experiences transform Nancy Wheeler into someone who lives between two extremes, rationality and instinct. She learned that the world can be cruel, but she also discovered that courage is born precisely in situations where everything seems lost. This mix of traumas and discoveries makes her a practical but emotionally complex person. And the most interesting part is seeing how each of her choices is a direct reflection of what she has lived, as if the past were the map of her decisions. Nancy becomes a woman driven by purpose. Guilt becomes a sense of justice. Fear becomes impulse, and pain becomes fuel. She channels suffering into action, and this is one of the most powerful psychological transformations a person can experience. It is when trauma stops being a prison and becomes an engine. But the price for this is high. She starts living in a constant state of readiness, as if there were always something to solve, something to fight. This mindset shapes even her relationships. Nancy has difficulty relaxing, allowing herself to simply be. It is as if her mind operates in an automatic alert mode. She does not trust easily, does not open up easily, and therefore often seems distant, when in reality she is just trying not to lose herself in the internal whirlwind. The armor that protects her is the same one that prevents her from feeling fully with time. Nancy begins to understand that her strength does not come from being unshakable, but from being able to keep going even when shaken. This difference is subtle, but it changes everything. Because true maturity is not about becoming cold, it is about learning to rise after each fall. And this is her journey. Someone who goes from emotional rigidity to conscious vulnerability, the kind of strength that no longer needs to pretend to be perfect. It is beautiful to notice that despite all the suffering, Nancy never stops fighting for what she believes in. This shows that she is not driven only by trauma, but also by a deep sense of justice. She wants things to make sense, for what is right to prevail, and this pursuit is what keeps her flame alive. It is almost as if the chaos around her serves to reinforce her own identity. Deep down, Nancy becomes a symbol of emotional resilience. Someone who carries scars, but who has learned to turn them into narrative strength. She is no longer the perfect girl seeking approval. Now she is the woman who creates her own path, even when no one believes in her, and that is liberating. Because Nancy's greatest revolution does not happen on the outside, it happens inside her. But of course, not everything is victory. The emotional armor is still there, and sometimes it weighs. There is still guilt, still fear, still doubt. But there is also awareness, and that changes everything. Because when we understand where the pain comes from, it loses the power to control us. Nancy learns to live with what she feels without needing to fight against herself. And it is precisely this balance between strength and fragility that makes her one of the most human characters in Stranger Things. But there is a question that still lingers in the air. Will Nancy ever truly be able to rest from the role of someone who always needs to be strong? So, what did you think of diving into the mind of Nancy Wheeler? Did you notice how each fear, each guilt, and each decision shaped the woman she became? This journey shows that strength is not the absence of pain, but the ability to continue even when everything feels impossible. And the great insight is that by understanding her story, we begin to reflect on our own choices and fears, because deep down, we all have our own internal upside-down worlds. Now I want to know, which character do you want me to analyze in the next video on the channel? I want to keep bringing these deep analyses that make us truly connect with the stories. And if you have not subscribed yet, take this moment, activate notifications, and stay updated on everything. That way, you keep learning, reflecting, and having fun with every character that comes across our radar.